denies the existence of anything like an essence in things. Speaking in regard to the creation of man, Occam says, if God were to create a man out of nothing, this would not affect any other man, as far as his essence is concerned. He believes that all being is equivocal with other being. In other words, the being in one tree is completely different and not at all similar outside the mind with the being in another tree. On the other hand, Aquinas believes that all created being is analogous. For example, Aquinas means that any two created beings are both similar and different from each other. He also means created being is both similar and different from the Creator, who is the source of all being and the source of all beings' oneness and unity. This is because, as was explained previously, God exists in himself, and God alone possesses the fullness of being. His essence and his existence are one. The problem of universals is a question of the reality of essences and their existence. Essence and existence are vital metaphysical concepts to understanding the world around us, because the realist metaphysics and epistemology of Aquinas are necessarily interdependent. Realist epistemology contends the object of intelligence is reality, while metaphysical realism contends reality is intelligible. In denial of the realist view, Occam believes universals exist in the mind only with no real connection to the world outside the mind. But isn't Occam's view of universals self-contradictory? If all trees are different, how is it that we can call them all trees? The very sentence that says all trees are not really the same presupposes that they are. Something in trees must justify our use of the universal term trees. We speak with universal terms, not in particular terms. When we speak about trees, the term trees refers to trees in general. It seems that trees must resemble each other in something. What could this be other than their nature, essence, their treeness, what they really are? If trees are not really the same outside the mind in reality, then it isn't really correct to call them all trees. Peter King, in his failure of Occam's nominalism, points to what he believes is the key failure in Occam's approach to the problem of universals. What is clear is that Occam's theory fails to show how groups of similar things are similar in this theory. King believes Occam could not develop a coherent theory of the underlying semantic mechanism of signification that related his idea of general mental concepts to spoken and written language. He argues Occam's problem is symptomatic of a deeper problem, that relying on pictures as the proposed mechanism of signification of mental concepts to words is relying on pictures which are mere signs themselves and incapable of communicating reality reliably. As I've mentioned before, the key to understanding reality in the world around us, epistemologically, goes back to metaphysics. Nominalism has the difficulty of explaining semantic generality without relying on metaphysical generality. King summarizes the weakness of Occam's nominalism: the denial of real natural classes, and that we are somehow structured in some way as to grasp these classes without any metaphysical basis for the assortment into classes, or for our general terms to pick them out, seems no more than an empty refusal to take into account the evident difficulty such a conviction entails. Before we discuss Aquinas and Occam's approaches further, I will define some key concepts about terms we will need. What do we mean when we call a term univocal, equivocal, or analogical? A univocal term has one and only one meaning. For instance, when I say I ate an apple, the terms ate and apple are univocal. An equivocal term has two or more quite different and unrelated meanings. When I say the river has two banks and the town has two banks, I use the word banks equivocally, for there is no connection between a river bank and a money bank. An analogical term has two or more meanings that are A, partly the same and partly different, and B, related to each other. When I say a good man gave his good dog a good meal, I use the word good analogically, for there is at the same time a similarity and difference between a good man, a good dog, and a good meal. All three are desirable, but a good man is wise and moral, a good dog is tame and affectionate, and a good meal is tasty and nourishing. Words are only analogical, equivocal, or univocal when they are used in relation to other words. Before I turn back to Occam's approach, it will be helpful to survey some additional key ideas in Aquinas' moderate realist approach, which preceded Occam. Aquinas lived from 1225 to 1274. Occam lived a few years after Aquinas, from 1285 to 1349. Aquinas' view of nature and creation, the analogy of being. What does Aquinas mean by the term natural? For Aquinas, the term natural had to do with kinds of things, their origins and end, and what they do as they are organized in relation to one another, in a single whole co-participant, the world, which was created by God. All things in their relation to one another are natural. The basis of the existence of these very same things is supernatural, in terms of their origins, because all creation is ultimately gift. Since everything is created by God, it images Him. For Aquinas, then, since creation is from God, is directed towards God, and stands in relation to God, it is like God and revelatory of God. Nevertheless, this revelatory likeness is only analogous. This is the origin of the notion of analogia entis, or analogy of being. Analogy implies both likeness and unlikeness. According to Aquinas, when we say God exists and creatures exist, we are using the term exists analogously. For God to exist is to use the term with a meaning of independent, non-derivative existence. For us to exist means we exist depending on God's existence. Aquinas believes that since we are created out of nothing, in some way our being participates in God by analogy. This means that God possesses the plenitude of being, and thus every possible being He could make already pre-exists in God in His self-knowledge as Creator. Aquinas suggests that God is in things in a way that a thing known by us is in us, and is present in us through an act of existence. In the rational order, however, God is known to us as the cause of all things only through His effects, and thus God's substance is present to all things as the cause of their being. Aquinas teaches that since God creates things to be out of nothing and directs them towards God as their goal, God is the cause of things in a still deeper way as the formal cause. Because God is truth, beauty, goodness, and all other perfections. This means that God is not merely good in Himself and the cause of goodness in things, but the very goodness in God is analogically the goodness of created things, which never can in themselves possess goodness except in relation to God who gives them their form, existence, and purpose. The good of things can be considered in relation to other created things within the order of the world, but also the good of all things is ultimately found together, in their life together, in and with God as goodness itself. This is analogous in that, in one sense, we speak of things as being good in themselves, yet ultimately they are good in relation to God, as good in virtue of their existence from God, and their divinely appointed correlations with other things within an ordered whole. Let me repeat that sentence. This is analogous in that, one sense, we speak of things as being good in themselves, yet ultimately they are good in relation to God, as good in virtue of their existence from God, and their divinely appointed correlations with other things within an ordered whole. Aquinas' teaching on analogy also says creation has its own integrity as a created whole, so that creation itself explains further things in it. God wills everything to happen as it does, but not in a way that the true secondary causation among creatures and free choices of intelligent beings are in any way compromised. For Aquinas, creatures share real natures possessing essential forms, by which things stand in a real and ordered relationship with one another as part of the created whole. Thus they are analogically related to one another. In terms of language and epistemology for Aquinas, language must obviously be analogical, thus intrinsically involving a metaphysical component, assuming analogical relations among things. Knowledge for Aquinas arises in the reception of and action upon the real, mediated through language in which the real reveals itself to us. Since creation is a gift from God directed toward an end, which is God himself, the same order is present in creation itself, in knowledge which requires the receptive perception of the knower in order for the real to be truly known. Aquinas' theory of analogy of being is rejected by nominalism, which denies analogical terms and sentences, in favor of terms being either univocal or equivocal, but never analogical. In addressing the problem of universals, Aquinas also addresses a related problem that arises when we ask, how can that which is universal in the mind represent what is not universal in reality? This is called the problem of the one and the many. The key to how Aquinas approaches this problem is that he took the middle position between extremes to the question of universals. Plato's extreme realism says that universals exist both in the mind and outside the mind in another world. Plato says there is an existent form outside the mind in another world to answer the question of the one and the many. Nominalism says the opposite. One, either universals don't exist in its most extreme form, making the question of one and the many nonsensical since universals don't exist, or two, as I mentioned earlier with conceptualism, a more moderate form of nominalism, universals in some sense do exist, but only in the mind with no basis outside the mind in reality. Both the nominalist and conceptualist approaches to the one and the many cannot explain why things are similar in reality outside the mind, because they deny any basis in reality for their sameness outside the mind. They deny the existence of essences and substantial forms. Aquinas' moderate realist view says things exist as particulars and deny the extreme realist views of existence of forms in another world. Instead,